Coeli Fitzpatrick has an interesting story. I was just hearing part of it at lunch about her being you were 19, were you? 21 in the airport in Egypt, in Cairo, and realizing she was in a foreign land. We'll let her tell you more about that. Somebody helped her, and that was a good thing. At that time, she was on her way to Amman, Jordan, to study Arabic for a year at the age of 21. She is now a professor of philosophy at Grand Valley State University in the Frederick Meyer Honors College, and she's the chair of the honors faculty. She's originally from Phoenix, so how you doing with Michigan? That's a different country too, isn't it? And she received her BA in philosophy from Regis University in Denver, Colorado, and a PhD from the State University of New York in Binghamton. She teaches several courses in the Honors College, including the first year sequence called The Middle East Beyond the Headlines. I'll bet your freshman students are pretty fascinated with that, and lacking in knowledge, I suspect. She also teaches a junior seminar on Islamophobia, which is what she's going to talk to us about today. Her publications include the award-winning edited volume, Muhammad in History, Thought and Culture, as well as writings on Edward Said and Orientalism. Professor Fitzpatrick's current research focuses on the connection between Christian rationality and anti-Islam sentiment during the 11th to 14th centuries. I was recently in Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia about 2 months ago, and I realized I too was in a very foreign country where people dress differently. I was telling her at lunch, our tour guide, one day we had a 4-person tour with a guide and a driver. They're both dressed in their white thobes and looking very handsome. And it was a Friday, and the guide said, if you don't mind, we're going to pull over and park for a while. We have to go to prayer. We'll leave the car running so the air conditioning will continue. And they parked in the shade and ran off, and all the men in the neighborhood were running down the street to prayer, and they all came back at the same time. And it was an experience that we don't have here very often unless we go seeking it. So we're going to ask you to help us understand more about Islam so we are not Islamophobic. Thank you. Give a grand forum welcome to Coeli.
Thank you, Jan, and thank you everyone for coming today. If this microphone gets strange sounding, just give me a signal and I'll try to fix it. Yes, we were talking about my experience. I had, sometimes people ask, how does a Irish Catholic family end up with a daughter heading off to the Middle East in the early 90s? When there was no internet and you didn't really know what you were getting into. My parents didn't really know what I was doing. I just came home and told them, I'm going to Jordan. I'm going to study Arabic for a year. And really the answer is a teacher. I had a fabulous history teacher at Regis University who taught the Middle East, and I didn't know what I was doing. I was taking a general education course, so cheers for general education courses that introduce you to things that you didn't expect to learn. And I loved it, and it was too late to change my major from philosophy to history because I was a junior. And so I thought, well, I'll just, follow both of them. And so my career trajectory has always sort of been a meeting of history and philosophy. So yes, I found myself in Cairo airport, not speaking Arabic, and not really any English signs, and the guy on the plane next to me helped me find someone to sit next to who worked at the airport and gave me tea and a signal to me at the time that it was time for me to get on my next plane. And I found the hospitality in the Arab world was really, and still is, phenomenal. I mean, I could just tell you stories about Arab hospitality, but I won't. I'll get to my presentation, but I will tell you one thing. One time we found ourselves lost in the desert, which can happen in Jordan. And so we pulled out, remember, it's before GPS and smartphones, and so you're really just going on your paper maps and word of mouth. So we pulled over and found this Bedouin family, and they told us where we were going, but they insisted we have tea with them. And that's so common. Just, imagine a random stranger, oh, come in and have some tea. And that kind of experience happened a lot. Now, I will say I was there in the 90s, so this was before 9/11. It was also before a great influx of refugees into Jordan from Syria, from the Syrian war, and from the Lebanese economic crisis and the Iraq war and all of these things, which has put pressure on the city in ways that probably make people less hospitable, as you can imagine. It was a different era. But I still treasure it and the memories that I have. Before I get started on this presentation, I'll just give you a brief sense of how I got here. So, as Jan mentioned, I'm doing research on Christian rationality, and particularly how Christian rationality changes over time. So it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone who, when you hear the medieval period, the stereotype about the medieval period is that it's the Dark Ages and, people were slaves to religion, and a lot of that's just hyperbole and stereotype. But there is something to this idea of reason being something that initially intellectuals were rather skeptical about. What you really needed was authority, the church fathers, so looking back to Augustine from the 4th century. But over time, as you move into the 10th and 11th century, people start to be a little less skeptical about this idea of reason, particularly logic. And so before, where reason would be something that other people were, and that wasn't a good thing, Christianity starts to internalize the idea that we are rational. And as they do that, they start to apply irrationality as a pejorative against other groups, particularly Jewish and Muslim people and their ideas. So I trace that history. And that leads us to thinking about how the West, if you will, or Europe, characterizes or discusses and talks about the Muslim and how that changes over time. So I have here these 3 words: affinity, expropriation, and denial. And these are just some throwaway lines from an essay, or a chapter actually, in the book by Jonathan Lyons, Islam Through Western Eyes. He just uses them, but I make them much more significant. And so I'm going to take you through a journey of affinity, expropriation, and denial. So Christians as looking to the Arab Muslim world with affinity and, oh wow, there's really something that we can learn from these folks. And then the expropriation, right, taking it and then announcing it as one's own, if you will. And then finally denying that there really was anything there to begin with. And I think, unfortunately, the longest tail of that trio is the denial phase. And we are really still in that to a great extent. So we'll get to that at the end of the presentation. I'll go through all of this and then ask if there's questions at the end. So if there's anything you want to go back to in the presentation, definitely we can do that. So I'm going to start at today, or recently, I should say. These numbers are a couple of years old, but this $100 million, the amount received by anti-Muslim groups in the United States from just a 2-year period of 2017 to 2019. So this is money that's going into advertisements, sort of promoting anti-Islamic sentiment, the protest at what was called the Ground Zero Mosque, you might have heard about that, anti-Sharia, the push for anti-Sharia legislation, it had its heyday a couple of years ago throughout the United States. And all of that takes funding, and so a lot of these anti-Islam groups were receiving a good deal of money in order to promote that message. CARE, which is the Council for Arab-Islamic Relations in the United States, documented over 10,000 incidents of anti-Muslim bias in that 6-year period. I have some figures that are more updated at the end of the presentation. And there were thousands of anti-mosque incidents. So these are incidents of graffiti or violence, destruction that were done across the United States in this 2-year period. And then 40 incidents of institutional leaders sharing or posting anti-Muslim content. So these are people who are in the public eye, sometimes politicians or newscasters or people who are going to share this kind of anti-Islamic sentiment really unabashedly. So my question, or what we're going to look at today, is how did we get there and how far back does this go? So we're going to go way back in time. And we're actually going to start with this period of affinity. And we're looking at mainly, so Europe, you know, not as it looks like today, but think of the Iberian Peninsula, which we talk about today as Spain and Portugal, is almost entirely under Muslim control. So a lot of people forget that what we call Spain today was ruled by Muslims for approximately 800 years. Now, it wasn't all the same territory. The northern border kept shrinking over time until finally there was just this small corner down in the southeastern part, which is Granada, the Nasrid Kingdom, that was finally taken over in 1492 by Isabella and Ferdinand. But for a long time, Spain was ruled by Muslims. And so there were in Spain, or in what we call, just to not be anachronistic, the Iberian Peninsula, these interactions daily, you could say, between Muslims and Catholics, and people who didn't really know what their religion was because they were sort of out in the middle of nowhere. But in the rest of Europe, really, they didn't have any sense of Muslims, they didn't have any sense of Islam. And in the late 11th century, we have a document from Pope Gregory VII. So in 1076, he writes to the Muslim ruler, the Hamdadid ruler in what is today in Algeria, North Africa. And he's asked, the emir had asked the Pope to send a bishop to his territory in order to take care of the spiritual needs of the Christians who lived there. So just kind of think about how that statement alone would blow some people's mind, right? That a Muslim would say, hey, you know, I got these Christians and I can't really do anything for them spiritually, so could you send down a bishop so that they can practice their religious activities with somebody who knows what's going on? And Pope Gregory agreed, and he writes back, he says, we believe, meaning you and I, right, believe and confess, albeit in a different way, the one God. So this is an acknowledgement that Islam is a monotheistic religion. And he's also saying, we believe in this one God, which again, you know, even today you have people saying, well, the God of Islam is not my God. And here this guy in the Dark Ages, in the medieval period, is saying, we believe in the same God, but we practice it in a different way. And each day we praise and honor him as creator of the ages and ruler of this world. And so you just think, this letter is really, really interesting that it happened at all. And it shows you something about the state of what we could call Muslim-Christian relations during this time. A word of caution, though, when I use the phrase Muslim-Christian relations, it almost makes it sound like there's some kind of plan. But we have to understand that these things are really one-on-one, right? So who I might know in the town next door, or this relationship between these two heads of state. There's not a blanket Christendom that's interacting with a blanket Islam, at least not yet. When this letter is written, that is certainly the case. Okay, but we fast forward just a couple of years, 2 decades later, and we have the call to crusades by Pope Urban II in his speech at Clermont. And this, you know, I think if you went out on the street and you said to somebody, what was the first crusade about? Well, I hope they could answer something. I hope they might be able to say what a crusade was. Let's assume that much anyway. I think the person might say, oh, it was a holy war between Christianity and Islam. And there's something to that, but it's not all of the truth. So what do we know about when Pope Urban II gathered people at Clermont and called for this first crusade? Well, we don't actually have any written account of the crusade call itself from 1095. What we have are later people writing about it. And that's significant because people are writing with different motivations. And they're not always, nobody's sitting there as a stenographer just writing down word for word what the Pope is saying. So we have to piece it together. How do we do that? Well, we have three major accounts of the First Crusade. And the first one is by an anonymous author who was on that crusade. This is known as the Gesta Francorum, or just the Gesta. It's probably written in 1100, which was 1 year after the capture of Jerusalem by the Christian forces. And this knight was traveling with Bohemond, who was there. He was one of the leading commanders. And the Gesta doesn't talk about the Pope's speech at all. He's really talking, he's a knight, and so he's talking about this as an account of war. What did he see there? And so he talks about, he doesn't protect his audience from the horrors of the crusade. He even talks about in fact, this is how we know about it, the incident of Christian cannibalism. So we have the account in Arabic, but we also have it in Latin, that they were starving. I mean, if you read these accounts, I mean, it's really horrific. Not to sympathize with the Crusaders too much, but they had a tough time. They were very hungry, and so they ate bodies that they found in the Syrian town of Mara. And they also looked for coinage that might have been ingested by people to protect it. And our friend who wrote this doesn't hold back. He just tells us all of this. But it has no suggestion that this is a holy war. When we think of holy war, we think of an existential fight for the survival of one side or the other, right? Christianity against Islam, good against evil. And the Gesta doesn't give us any sense of this. It's just an account of a knight and what he sees and experiences in this journey. So this is from the Gesta, and he writes, the following people, this is about the siege of Jerusalem in 1099. The following morning, our people climbed the roof of the temple and attacked the Saracens, men, women, and decapitated them with drawn swords. Some threw themselves from the top of the temple. No one has ever heard and no one has ever seen such a slaughter of the pagan peoples. Pyres like haystacks were set up, and nobody save God alone knows their number. So you can see it's a very violent account of the siege of Jerusalem, which we knew. We have the sources from the Gesta. We have the Arabic sources. The Arabic sources tell us that the knees of the horses the blood of the streets was up to the horses' knees. And we also have sayings of some of the Christian commanders, because if you think about Jerusalem at this time in 1099, who was there? Well, there were certainly Muslims there. It had been in Muslim hands for several centuries, but there were also many Arab Christians living there, and there were also many Jewish people living there, Arab Jews. And so some of the Crusaders worried, we might be killing the wrong people. And the sort of infamous saying that you may have heard, kill them all, God will sort it out. This is what would happen. So a lot of people would take refuge in holy buildings like the temple or the church of the Holy Sepulchre. It didn't matter. Everybody was slaughtered that you could find. And so it was really a horrific experience for the Arabs, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim who lived there. And our Gesta author doesn't hold back. Okay, our next source for the Crusades is Fulcher of Chartres, and he's writing about 6 years later. And Fulcher does tell us about the Pope's speech. So remember, our anonymous author hasn't told us anything about the Pope's speech, but Fulcher does. He has what we might call a book It's not very long, but it's a book. And he talks about what he remembers as from the Pope's message. So the big problem for the Pope was there needed to be a reform of society. So you had this night class, and they didn't have a lot to do when they weren't engaged in wars. And really, they needed something to do. And there was a lot of societal unrest. And you just almost had, in some places, like real anarchy. And the Pope is chastising his Christians, saying, get it together, basically. And the idea is if you send people, give them something to do, right? Give them something to do, and they'll be less concerned with killing each other and burning fields and that kind of thing in Europe. So they're also chastised for how they behave towards one another, which was not very Christian-like. So he's saying, you have to behave more knightly. You have to behave more like gentlemen and not just go with your base instincts, really. And the clergy are upbraided for their failure to lead by example. So they were not good models of knightly behavior either. And so finally we get to, we have one more, the discussion of the Cluny Reform movement, which was a big reform movement that the church was trying to head with the Cluny monastery that was part of European history. So by chapter 3, Fulcher comes to the Pope's actual speech, and he says that the Pope asked them to go to war against the Turks, a Persian people. So if you know anything about Turkey and Iran, those are two different countries, two different peoples, two different languages. But we don't have these distinctions, and in fact, there is no word for Muslim, there is no word for Islam until the 17th century. So they were either called Saracens, which is a word that predates Islam. It actually goes back to about the 3rd or 4th century, maybe even longer than that, or Turkish or Persian, or sometimes infidels, sometimes Ishmaelites, sometimes later Mohammedans. So it just depended, but not Muslim and not Islam. So why is this significant about Fulcher's account, or the fact that there's no account of the Pope's speech? Because that allows people to sort of write what they need to in order to promote their agenda. So our next, we have some more Fulcher here. So he says about these Turks, what a race, what a disgrace, if a race so despicable and enslaved by demons should thus overcome a people endowed with faith in Almighty God and resplendent in the name of Christ. So just remember that message of Pope Gregory in 1076 about sharing one God, albeit in different ways. And this, there really is as night and day. So a very short time period has taken place in which we're going to see this change from Muslims as possibly dangerous, if you're with some that are dangerous or in the right place, or possibly not, to this idea that all Muslims everywhere are a threat to all Christians. They're a people enslaved by demons. And once you've gotten to that point, it's hard to go back. But they will for a little while. Okay, finally we have of the 3 early sources, we have Robert the Monk's Historia. And this is a redaction of the Gesta. Remember, the Gesta is that early just account of war. And what Robert does is he needs to get another crusade. So he needs to whip up enthusiasm. And so he kind of takes out some of the brutal parts, and he puts in this, really, the Muslims are terrible and we need to go back and get them. So he's trying to get people excited for a second crusade. When we talk about the crusades, they span, centuries. And the popes are always trying to get people enthusiastic for them. And it's hard because the knights come back with stories about the hardship. Some of them stay there and, they're there for a long time. They become Arabized in a way. But people do go back to Europe, and they don't really, it's not always fun and games. It's hard to whip up enthusiasm. So Robert tries, though. He talks about the Muslims as beyond the pale, cut off from God. He doesn't talk about the horrors of the First Crusades, because remember, he needs to get people to go. And so he's going to be careful. And he talks about the horrors of the foul races. And they defile these holy places. So please come help us, keep this territory. They have Jerusalem. Help us keep it and help us keep these foul races from defiling it. So on the one hand, we have these church figures calling for crusades. But we also have, remember, this is the period of affinity. So we also have this time of great cultural exchange, particularly in places like Spain initially, but now also in Jerusalem, in Syria, in Lebanon, where the Crusaders stay. So you have these great crusade exchanges, and they start to realize, wow, these people have some really good ideas about medicine, about math, about philosophy. They have books that we don't have. And so you start to have this awareness on the part of intellectuals in Europe that the Muslim world has something really interesting to offer. About the 11th century, we have the translation movement, which starts in so Toledo, which is in the middle of Spain, it's taken over by the Christians in 1085. And when they take over, what they find is, it blows their mind, because they find that for how long they'd been there, the Arabs had been teaching and translating and commenting upon this knowledge, a lot of it which they got from the Greeks. So the Greek mathematicians, Greek philosophers, Greek scientists, they had medicine, they had ideas about medicine, which, they were cutting crosses in people's head and peeling back the skin to let the evil spirits out. When the Arab physicians are like, let's bring the fever down. Let's see if we can, put some herbs on that and make this person feel better. So what started was this translation movement. It was a bit of a frenzy. And you start to have the church involved, where the church is sending people into Toledo and Spain to get these books that are in Arabic and paying people to translate them into Latin. The most famous of that is Peter of Cluny, the abbot of the very large monastery. And Peter, he has to convince Robert of Ketton. Robert of Ketton is there translating mathematic texts. And Peter's like, I really want a copy of the Quran. And he's like, no, I'm busy. And no, you have to get this text, right? So he pays him an enormous sum in order to get him to stop what he's working on in terms of translating Arabic math into Latin and translate the Quran. He manages to do it, but it took some money. So we also have people like Adelard of Bath. So Adelard is a philosopher, and he says, he's talking to his nephew, and he's telling him, it's the Arab world is where it's at. We really have to go there. So he says, the Europeans follow their intellectual orthodoxy. Again, the church fathers, right? So Augustine is the big guy. He says that the Arabic science has freed man to explore the natural world with his own faculties. And he tells his nephew, for I've learned one thing from my Arab masters, with reason as guide, but you another, you follow a halter, being enthralled by a picture of authority. And he's telling his nephew, if you want to learn anything, you've got to get out of Europe and you've got to go south, right? Either Spain or to those Crusader territories where you can learn from the Arabs. Daniel of Morley, 12th century, 12th to 13th, he says, for the love of the Almagest, which was the great astronomical work of Ptolemy, which he could not find among the Latins, he went to Toledo. There, seeing the abundance of books in Arabic on every subject and regretting the poverty of the Latins in these things, he learned the Arabic language in order to be able to translate it. So he's thinking, this is where I have to go if I'm going to learn anything. And he has another line where he talks about Paris as having nothing to teach. So we have just this list here, coffee, the first thing. So the Arabs brought us coffee. There's a story about a goat that was getting really hyper, and somebody's like, what is that goat eating? And that's probably apocryphal. It's probably not really true. But in any event, coffee from Yemen. Algebra, so the word algebra is itself Arabic. It's an Arabic word. Algorithm is another one, too, I didn't put on the list. The study of optics was huge in the Arab world. And for that, they also learned how to do cataract surgery. So they were doing cataract surgery very early. They had hospitals with dedicated wards. So the Greeks engaged in contamination control. They would quarantine people in different places to avoid spreading disease. But what the Arabs did was a little bit different. They would group people in different wards based on what they thought they had. A lot of these had yet to be named. One of the Arabic authors, the medical author, he identified smallpox and measles, and so they were able to sort of put people together so that they wouldn't cross-contaminate with different things. They also had free treatment of the poor. This was considered a charitable thing, and charity is one of the five, what we call the 5 pillars of Islam. And so treating people for free in the hospital was a value. And then astronomy, which they made great advances, building on the Greek astronomy during the medieval period. So how do we reconcile these two positions, right? On the one hand, we have, oh, the Arab world is where to be. And on the other hand, we have, you know, these people that are possessed by demons and beyond the pale of God. So, you know, they had this dilemma. I mean, the history of philosophy is a history of trying to reconcile points that don't quite add up, right? And so what they said was, sorry, that writing is small. I don't know if you can see it in the back. I thought it looked bigger on my screen. But one way was to claim that the Muslim intellectuals had secretly denounced Islam. And so that's what they said. They said, well, you know, that Avicenna, he wasn't really a Muslim. They had no evidence for this. And in fact, we know they're completely wrong. But they just decided, oh, they must have, because they're really smart. How could you be Muslim and be smart? So they must not have really been Muslim. So this brings us to our second phase, which is expropriation. So we have affinity, they're doing great things over there, but then we're moving into, well, this stuff is really great, but I don't know about Islam. Why don't we just take this stuff, this intellectual booty, if you will? So let's see, let me just go back to that. So we have a couple examples of this. I'm going to give you two. So one of them is William of Auvergne, who was Bishop of Paris in the 13th century. And he had read the philosopher-physician Avicenna. Now, William didn't read Arabic, but by this time, you have it in Latin. So all those translators in Toledo, they're producing these manuscripts, and now we have paper, and so they can put it on paper, and it's easier, and you can have more books. And so William had read it, and he loved it. I mean, a lot of his career, a lot of his philosophy is based on Avicenna's work. But he was dismayed that Avicenna seemed to think that the Muslims' idea of paradise was serious. The Muslims, you may have heard, if you read in the Quran, the descriptions of paradise are very physical, right? Flowing rivers, the things you wouldn't have necessarily had in the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century. Grapes, flowing rivers, that kind of thing. And William is like, how can they believe that they really get to sit by rivers eating grapes? Now, I should add as just a parenthetical that as he writes this, William and pretty much everybody, Christian who had intellectual training, believed that paradise lost was still on earth, right? So the paradise that Adam and Eve were expelled from, that still existed. And so he's saying, well, this Avicenna guy is really crazy because he believes in this paradise that's, you know, up there in the sky. But our paradise here, oh yeah, it's really there. You can't go to it because we've been thrown out of it. So I say that just to say, you know, when they talk about something as being irrational, they're a little selective in how they use that term. So he says, well, the solution, of course, is that Avicenna didn't really believe this. He just secretly denied it. And so he says, for these reasons, some of the wise among the Saracens hold that Muhammad did not understand these promises literally. On this point, he showed himself to be not a philosopher, but a partaker in madness. So where Avicenna is saying, oh yeah, we believe this. Incidentally, Avicenna didn't believe this, but that's another discussion. He, as no philosopher did, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, they all had allegorical interpretations of scripture. But he said, he must not have been a philosopher then. He was just mad. And he said, Avicenna was so great a philosopher to be able to see beyond such absurdities as the denial of individual immortality, and yet he neglected to do so. So Avicenna, we can just write off the parts we don't like as him being irrational. Another person, this is 14th century, so Giordano de Pisa, he's a Dominican theologian, and he said, of all the philosophers who were great philosophers, none of them could love the things of the world. They damned the laws of the Saracens as it was, since they, the Saracens, look to earthly delights. And if one were to ask, are there not philosophers among them? I answer that there were. Avicenna was a Saracen and a philosopher, and he mocked their law and ridiculed it. Again, we have zero evidence for this, that he was doing this. Okay, so the role of reason. So because Christianity by the 13th, 14th century had decided that they liked this thing of reason, they said that Christian is rational, Muslims and Jews were irrational unless they converted. And the Arab works could be Christianized. So the greatest accomplishment of this was Thomas Aquinas, who took the parts of Aristotle and the commentaries of Averroes that he liked and made them Christian. And he becomes, arguably one of the greatest philosophers, of the medieval period. Some people would say of all time, but I'm looking at some of my fellow philosophers and I thought, they might challenge me on that. So of the medieval period. Okay, so there were stories, people did convert. Muslims converted to Christianity, and sometimes freely even, and these were happily recounted. And so we get to Humbert of Romans, who initially thinks these stories are great. These Muslims are converting, we need to learn Arabic. He's sending people to learn Arabic and Hebrew, all kinds of languages so that they can convert people to Christianity. But then he finds out that these are kind of overblown, that it's not really happening in the numbers that he was led to believe. And so then he changes. And we can see that in his career. We can see early on he's just very enthusiastic. Let's go convert everybody. Late career, he's saying, no, they reject all reason. And so you're wasting your time. And so what we have to do is just force them to convert or kill them. So it's quite a change in the course of this one guy. And he calls them irrational. So we get this idea that they're profane people who are polluting the Holy Land. And so he adds, just for some spice, that they engage in illicit sex and other abominable acts before the crucifix. And we'll see that. That's a theme that recurs several times. So still in the 14th century, we have our friend Dante, who wrote Paradise Lost. He's writing, putting Muslim sages such as Averroes in the outermost circle of hell. So Muhammad is considered a Christian heretic. So still this idea, is this a different religion or is it just Christianity gone wrong? And he decides, is Christianity gone wrong? Muhammad is a heretic, and Ali, who was the founder of, or the whole Shia split has to do with who's going to succeed Muhammad. Ali is also considered a heretic. So he puts him in the outermost circle of hell to be rent asunder for all time. And so here's a depiction of it. You can see Muhammad there. Do I have a little? Yeah, so here's Muhammad here. He's kind of pulling his chest apart, and he's going to be doing that for all of time. This circle of hell, the 8th circle, is called the Malbolge, and it's reserved for simple fraud. So fraud that is without particularly malicious intent. So he's not really blaming Muhammad for being wrong, but he has to suffer that. And so we read, while I was intent on watching him, he looked at me. And with his hands he spread his chest and said, see how I split myself. See how maimed Muhammad is. And he who walks and weeps before me is Ali, whose face is open wide from chin to forelock. And all the others here whom you can see were, when alive, the sowers of dissension and scandal, and for this they are now split. So who else is in this circle? We have Ulysses, and we have Pope Nicholas III, and Tiresias, the seer from Greek drama. So those are some. There were other people in there, others there, but these are some that people might know. Okay, now, so we've gone affinity, we've gone appropriation, Thomas Aquinas really being the prime example of that, and now we have denial. When you get to the 14th century and the humanists, they have decided that nothing good came from the Arab world. And now by this time, a lot of things had come, but now they've been taken over. So they've been expropriated by the Christian Europe, and so we can deny where we got them. And so Petrarch says, there was nothing good about the Muslim intellectuals of the medieval period, and they added nothing to human intellectual history. And he says, I shall scarcely be persuaded that anything good can come from Arabia. But you learned men, through some strange mental illness, celebrate them with great, and unless I am mistaken, underserved trumpeting. So he's chastising his fellow humanists and saying, I don't know why you're doing this. There's nothing that's good from this, so why are you doing it? And this is the view that really prevails. There's lots of exceptions to this, so we don't want to paint anything, with too, broad a stroke saying that there were no exceptions. But Petrarch's understanding is the one that dominates. Okay, so now we're in the modern period. So this is Edward Said, and he wrote a book in 1979 called Orientalism. And he's trying to describe this idea of the sense that people have an understanding about what the Orient is without ever having been there, without having known anybody from there necessarily, and just paint these categorizations or stereotypes about the people who live there. And so he doesn't name this term. It wasn't Said who made this term up, but he's the one that really popularizes it. And he said, Orientalism is a way of coming to terms with the Orient that's based on the Orient's special place in European Western experience. In addition, the Orient has helped define Europe, or the West, as its contrasting image, idea, personality, or experience. And so he says, what Orientalism does is it paints an image of the West, and we've already seen that in some ways that's rational, and then an image of the East, or the Orient, that's irrational. So here we have just some characterizations, right? So on this left side, rational, civilized, there's gender equity, there's peaceful, they're peaceful people, and they're religious in the right way. Whereas the East is irrational, it's uncivilized, it's barbaric, it's paternalistic and misogynistic, it's violent, and it's enslaved to a controlling religion. And this largely becomes the lens through which Westerners see the Orient. Now, Said, there's a lot more to him. He talks about power relationships, and he talks about how there's this relationship between colonialism and the way that the Orient is constructed. But for our purposes now, this is enough. So how do we find this evidence that Said is talking about? So he says it's in the material culture. So just like an archaeologist will go and dig up a city and find something, what is this? So it's maybe a cooking pot or it's an instrument of something. Said goes back to the intellectual culture of the 19th and 20th century. And so I've got some examples of things that Said has studied. So Edward William Lane's The Manners and Customs of the Modern Egyptians, John Stuart Mill on liberty. Now, Mill was mainly talking about India, but he talks about the native as being a perpetual child, or at least until you can kind of raise the native up to being in a place where he can rule himself. Chateaubriand, the French writer, George Eliot in her book Daniel Deronda, and then we have Mozart's The Abduction at the, from the Seraglio, which is one of the examples in music of a kind of Orientalist production. The music stuff is a little less tenuous, more tenuous. Said was not quite as convincing, you could say. So let's look at some examples of material culture. So a lot of this painting helps. These are, the next couple slides are some examples of what we call Orientalist art. So this is Jean-Léon Gérôme, the snake charmer, late 19th century. And you can see you have what I like to call a gaggle of men here. They're just kind of slouched there. And one thing I want you to look at in these pictures is, what are the men doing? And you'll find that they're either lounging around being entertained by women or children or animals. They're praying or they're fighting. That's it. That's what they do. And so here they're doing two things. They're lounging and ogling at this child while the snake charmer is there. And you can see you have some scribbles. It's not actually Arabic because Jérôme didn't read Arabic, but you know he knew that there were squiggly things, and so he included them. And this painting is the cover of Said's 1979 book. This is the one that he chose. This is the Sultan's favorite by the Spanish artist Martin. And it's kind of a fuzzy example, but you can see here's the Sultan here, and here's his favorite. And so we have, again, the man and the woman. Notice the skin color in the original. You can see he's always going to be very dark, and the women are always perpetually vitamin D deprived, you could say. In fact, they're luminescent almost. You know, as an Irish American, I have pale skin, but really they've never been in the sun, you could see. And then all of the trappings of what you would think of as the Orient. So, you know, the incense, the carpet, the sort of decaying background that we'll see, and then just layers of texture, which make it a beautiful painting. I mean, Said was the first to say, we're talking about beautiful art. He was not critiquing the work of the artist per se, but just the image that it's promoting. Here's another painting of a harem woman from 1910, and you can see again, she's just kind of lounging there. I don't know who stands like that, just hanging out here like this. And so what Said said is that these paintings, they don't really tell us anything about the Orient, but they tell us a lot about the minds of the Europeans who both painted and consumed them, and, you know, patronized them and put them on their walls and that kind of thing. And, you know, these are just some examples. There's hundreds of these, hundreds, and they all show the same kind of images. This one is one of my favorites here. This is Regnal's Summary Execution, and so just the title, right, Summary Execution. This painting was done at a time when there was this fear of authoritarianism because of political events in Europe, and there was kind of an admiring of the Turkish ruling, because the Turks, you know, they initially, they're certainly despotic in their own way, but they also had rules and some regulations, and there were European authors who wrote about those admiringly and saying, wow, you know, they really have a legal system here. We should think about having a legal system here where you can't have summary executions. But yet that doesn't fit with the image of the East. And so this painting, if you see it in the museum, and I haven't, but I have a friend who has, and she said, you're right at eye level with that head. And you can't really see it well, but he's wiping off his tunic, he's wiping the sword off. So he's not only just off with their heads, but he's kind of gross. You know, he's just gonna wipe off this guy's blood, and the head rolls down, and just the idea of there's no trial, there's no jury, he just decides that he's guilty, and the Sultan himself kills him, which again, it's not that it didn't happen, but imagine if you're seeing this, you think this is what happens in the East, right? This is what always happens. This is from an unknown artist, French school, 19th century, and again, sort of the luminescent skin and lounging around. This is in the harem. No male painter from the East, or from the West, or even the East, if you will, went into a harem, right? They were not going in there and setting up their painting, their easel, and painting. So where is this coming from? And again, hundreds of these paintings, and a lot of them depict the harem. And these women, you know, lounging around, playing, and so you think, okay, they're really thinking a lot about this. They really want to see a lot of these. This is one of my favorites. This is Ernst's The Favorite, and I just love the title, because the title is showing, it's like, she's one of many, right? She's his favorite, and he's petting her like a pet. And I drive my students crazy, because I do show them this, and I say, well, you can roll your eyes if you want, but I'll do a kind of, you know, I'll do a little analysis of like the hierarchy here. So we have him, and then we have her, and then we have the dead animal. So she's not quite on the level of the lion on the floor, but she's a pet, and she's a tame pet. And again, notice the skin contrast between the very pale woman and the very dark male. All kinds of other things we could do in terms of analysis if we had time, in terms of the props and the textures. Ernst, I like to say, he liked to move the same plant from painting to painting. You always count on these fern type things, or the palm, I guess it's. So he was true to that. Okay, another example of material culture, we have archaeology. So this is Sir Flinders Petrie, and he writes, "The Arab has a vast balance of romance put to his credit very needlessly. He is as disgustingly incapable as most other savages, and no more worth romancing about than Red Indians or Maoris." So just a very blanket statement of all these people are just needlessly praised, and there's really nothing to them. Here we have Ernst Renan, who was known for many, many things, but among them biblical studies. And he says, "One sees that in all things Semitic race appears to us to be an incomplete race by virtue of its simplicity." So you can see there, Europeans are complex, intellectual, Easterners are simple. "This race, if I dare use the analogy, is to the Indo-European family what a pencil sketch is to a painting. It lacks that variety, that amplitude, that abundance of life, which is the condition of perfectibility." So again, John Stuart Mill's sort of childlike person. It can never be raised or thought of in the same way. "Like those individuals who possess so little fecundity that, after a gracious childhood, they attain only the most mediocre virility, the Semitic nations experience their fullest flowering in their first age and have never been able to achieve true maturity," unlike the European. Renan also had said that since Averroes, who died in 1198, there had been no good coming out of the Arab world. He said, in 800 years, nothing else has come out. And last person is Chateaubriand, the French author, and he says, on the Muslims, he says, "Of liberty they know nothing. Of propriety they have none. Force is their God. When they go for long periods without seeing conquerors who do heavenly justice, they have the air of soldiers without a leader, citizens without legislators, and a family without a father." So they're just this kind of wild race. And the question you can ask is, what do these characteristics of the Arabs, of the Orient, of the Muslims, what do they give you permission to do? If they're not rational and you're rational, if they're like children and you're like an adult, if they're not, democratic and you're a democratic citizen, what does that give you permission to do? Okay, so now let's skip to the 21st century, and we can see the way of speaking about Muslims is just as vast and generalizing as some of these earlier characterizations. So Newsweek, Muslim Rage, keep in mind Muslims make up 1 billion people in the world. And so there might be Muslim Rage, but there's probably specific reasons or different, manifestations of that are not characterized by this sort of vast generalization. Here we have a talking points commentary. Is Islam a destructive force? There are exceptions, but they are few. And then a bunch of European or British headlines. Muslims tell us how to run our schools. Sniffer dogs offend Muslims. BBC put Muslims before you. Muslim schools ban our culture. So just this is kind of in the anti-Sharia craze. We have these. Okay, so here's this is news. This is different from what we had in the paintings. Here's our friend Aladdin. I like to tell my students, I'm going to ruin Aladdin for you. And I always get some groan. So we talk about Aladdin as a piece of contemporary contemporary material culture. And Said said that material culture affects us, but because it's not considered overtly political, it's in some ways more insidious, right? Because we don't consume it with an expectation of hearing a political speech. It's entertainment. And we don't even understand the ways that it shapes our perception. You may or may not have heard about the original lyrics to this. So the original lyrics, so I come from a land from a faraway place where the caravan camels roam. And that's still the same now. But this part changed. Where they cut off your ear if they don't like your face. It's barbaric, but hey, it's home. So there was an uprising, and not an uprising, but there was protest, and people managed to protest, and Disney changed the lyrics. The new ones aren't much better. It's first part's the same, but then it says, where it's dark and immense and the heat is intense, it's barbaric, but hey, it's home. And you think, well, okay, the heat is intense. Yes, that's true. But dark? I mean, what's particularly dark? I mean, they have electricity. I mean, you've been to Dubai, right? I mean, it's not particularly dark. And it's barbaric but hates home is still in the current one. Lots of work has been done on Disney, so I won't talk about that unless you want to later. Here's another, what we found when we analyze the media representations of Arabs in Hollywood are frequently the 3 Bs. So bombers, belly dancers, or billionaires. This is going to be what your Arab person is. So this is a George Melford's 1921 film, The Sheikh, where he has to rescue women. Women have to be rescued from this lascivious sheikh. The next one is Busta Rhymes' song Arab Money, which is much more recent. And then Clint Eastwood's American Sniper, which the opening scene, and actually American Sniper is a lot better than some of the earlier Orientalist films. I'd say it's a lot better, but then there's problems. This opening scene where the woman and her son are killed by the sniper, and they're just kind of collateral damage. This is in Iraq, and you're not asked as a viewer to sort of question, you know, why is this sniper shooting them, or what are they bombing about, right? There's no questioning of somebody's motives, legitimate or not. There's never any even portrayal of those motives. So social media really changes it. Remember, before you're looking at paintings or Chateaubriand, not the food, but the books from the author. Social media changes everything. So hate speech online has been linked to an increased violence towards minorities. So Islamophobia, as we'll see, it's not just bad for Muslims or people who are mistaken for Muslims, it's bad for everybody. It's linked to anti-Semitism, it's linked to hate crimes and xenophobia of all sorts. A 2021 study showed that half of the tweets against the Congresswoman Ilhan Omar during her campaign involved overtly Islamophobic or xenophobic language. So it's one thing to disagree with somebody's policies. It's another thing to use Islamophobic or xenophobic language in an attempt to discredit them. And the use of bots, robots, you know, that amplify and retweet, allows a kind of megaphone effect which amplifies hate speech. And social media companies have said that they're going to crack down on Islamic terror online, which is a good thing, right? You don't want ISIS or terror groups, you know, spreading their hate online. But unfortunately, what we've seen is that they're less willing to police right-wing groups from here or from Europe, making the spread of Islamophobia and other hate speech easier and faster. So we also have some public statements of anti-Muslim sentiment. I just have 2 here. So this was right after the 9/11 attacks. So this is former U.S. Representative John Cooksley, who says, anyone wearing a diaper on his head should expect to be interrogated as a possible suspect in the investigations of the terrorist attack. And of course, we know that he's referring to Muslim headdress. But to phrase it like that, even in the face of the horrific attacks, is still problematic. Lieutenant Gary Hensley, who was the head of the U.S. military chaplains in Afghanistan, and he told his soldiers that their job was to hunt down the country's Muslim population for Jesus and get the hound of heaven after them so that we can get them into heaven. That's what we do, that's our business. Now, he was taken to task for this, but we could see it's problematic. A Pew survey found that 70% of Americans said Islam has nothing in common with their own religious faith. So this, remember our guy from 1076 again. And asked to give one-word impressions of Islam, those surveyed offered negative attributes such as fanatical, radical, and terror. But the same people said they knew little or nothing about Islam. So, well, how do you know they're terrorists if you know nothing about it? Another poll found that 23% of respondents said it should be illegal for Muslim groups to meet and practice their faith. These are a little bit older. These are in the mid to late 2000s. And a Gallup poll found that the majority of Americans saw little or nothing to admire in Islam or the Muslim world. So again, this sentiment that we really saw at its peak with Petrarch is still here. That's why I said denial is the longest tail. Because we're still saying there's nothing that they gave us. What about coffee? Don't forget coffee. Okay, so Violence in a vacuum. So this is a way of kind of thinking about the decontextualization of violence that we see on the news. So during the Cold War, the United States saw everything through the lens of the Cold War, right? So we can think about that. But what about the war on terror? So we tend to see everything through this war on terror. So the Muslim who fights without a cause or goal, right? These attacks came for most Americans out of nowhere, with no cause, no understanding, no reason. And that sort of continues, that any violence perpetuated by Muslims is seen as being causeless. So here we have a protestation of the drone attacks. And we had drone attacks that started during the war on terror, really peaked with Obama. He was sort of the president of drone attacks. And often killing many, many civilians, people who were at weddings or gatherings or just in victims of that. And then over here you have an ISIS fighter. So you do have, these scenes of violence from the United States and from ISIS. But they're not seen as, not just equivalent, but there's no sort of justification. Not that you want to say that there could be a good one, but not even a discussion of what might be motivating someone to do that. The Quran after 9/11 became a bestseller. The idea that if you just read the Quran, you'd understand the motivations of the terrorists. And so you can see some of these, let me go back there. Some of the graffiti on the Islamic Center. All I need to know about Islam I learned on 9/11. Innocent until proven Muslim. So this idea that just being Muslim enough or just looking like a Muslim. So the first victim after 9/11 of a hate crime was a man in Arizona who was actually a Sikh. He was from the Sikh religion, which is not Islamic at all. It's a completely different religion. But the Sikh men wear a turban, and he was wearing a turban, and somebody killed him because they thought, well, he's part of the problem that's responsible for 9/11. Another manifestation of 21st century material can appear in new places. So in 2014, a series of ads ran in the largest metropolitan transit authority, so the New York Transit Authority, subway stations, and they were funded by the anti-Muslim activist Pamela Geller and her organization, the American Freedom Defense Initiative. She says, yesterday's moderate is today's headline. So this notion that the religion is inherently violent. So there's no such thing as a Muslim moderate. A moderate is just somebody who hasn't yet become radicalized to a point where they will commit a terror attack. And then it's not Islamophobia, it's Islamorealism. So I'm not being bigoted or xenophobic, I'm just being realistic. Another one, so Hamas is ISIS, Hamas is Al-Qaeda, Hamas is Boko Haram, Hamas is CARE, which is that organization in the United States on Islamic relations. Jihad is jihad. So this idea that there might be different groups with different agendas and different political circumstances is just discounted. You know, a Muslim is a Muslim, and a Muslim is always violent or potentially violent. So these are the kind of ads that greeted people in the subway stations. Here's another one, Islam contributing not one damn thing to humanity for 1,400 years. And you see this really brutal scene after a bombing. And these things, of course, they happen, right? But devoid of any context, you really are talking about violence in a vacuum. You don't have understanding. You just have this fear-mongering so that we can't get to a place where there would be any understanding. Studies show that anti-Muslim attitudes often coincide with other prejudices, such as anti-Semitic. So we can see that it's more likely to lead to poor attitudes about other religious minorities or other ethnic groups. Okay, I'm going to end with a little bit of hope. So in 2021, CARE received 5,000 something complaints, and this is down. It was a 23% decrease. So there have been fewer of these incidences. And we also saw in 2022, last year, that there were 189 elected officials who identify as Muslims across 30 states. So this is saying, you know, that people who dress as Muslim, who identify publicly as Muslim, can still get elected in the United States, despite this history of Islamophobia that we have. Now, I want to talk about something that's interesting. which is what Edward Said calls writing back. And he said the Orient had been written for, spoken for several hundred years, and that people who lived there, people who were Arab, people who were Muslim, they didn't really have a chance to tell their own story. It was always told for them. But in recent years, what we've seen is just a mushrooming of people who are kind of what we would say writing back. And this takes the form of social media or art or books, lots of books written that represent the Muslim world the way that authors who live there experience it or imagine it. And so here you have this picture that kind of went viral. You have these Islamophobic folks behind, you know, Islam is a religion of blood and murder. The blood from Jesus is given as a ransom for all mankind. If Muhammad were alive today, and I don't know what the other one says. And so this woman just took a picture of herself. She's wearing a hijab, she's got her peace sign, and she put it on social media, and it went viral. And people really liked this because they said, you know, she's not really doing anything except being present in front of these people with a peace sign. And so we talk about this as an example of writing back. It's a way of saying there's other ways to fight these stereotypes. So I have another example here. So this is the Moroccan painter, Lala Saidi. And all of her works look a lot like this. So she is inspired by some of those Orientalist paintings. And she does her own kind of rendition of this. So this one is one of my favorites. You have two women, and you can see they both have different skin colors, but they're sitting as equals. There's not a servitude indicated by one. And she also has, what is that, right? A music note. So she's got the scribbles. Remember Jerome had the scribbles? So she's doing the scribbles too. And instead of using the bright colors that the Orientalist painters used, she's just using white and you know, natural tones, the skin tones. And she's got a lot of things. And she is just one of so many painters who are saying, it's time for us to represent ourselves, and we're going to do it, and we're going to take back some of these things. So not all of these painters are painting based on some of these Orientalist paintings. They're doing original, they're all original, but they're doing, you know, whatever they want. But many of them are saying, let's reimagine this, let's tell a different story. My students, for their final project, one of the things that they do is they find all kinds of examples of writing back. And this one, I have to credit, one of my students found it. I had not heard of this painting, or this artist, because the students always find so much stuff. I mean, there's 25 of them, and they're out there hunting, and they get these great, they come back with these great finds. So I'm always happy to learn. Okay, I'm getting my signal, I'm getting my time signal. So I'm actually done. I'm right on time, right? So I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Coeli. You mentioned algebra and algorithms. The other Al is alcohol, the distillation process. And Europe went nuts about that, you know, with the monks and everything. So,
yeah, I mean, it really, they went nuts about a lot of things. There was this real quest and lots of money put towards sending people to the Arab world and coming back with this kind of stuff. Textiles, another one was something that the Arab world had. Lots of different fruits and, you know, even sanitation systems, things like that. Books in general. So a monastery was lucky to have 1 or 2 books. And then they went to Spain and they're like, oh my gosh, they have hundreds of books. And they, like, people just have books. So it's really one of so many things.
In the Arab world, do they have the same kinds of misconceptions about the West?
Sure. I mean, I think misconceptions exist in many places, right? I mean, it's easy to have misconceptions. And you can find polling about what perceptions Arab and Muslims have about the United States. I think some of the ones that I hear about from people from the Arab world where they'll say, oh, you know, I grew up watching Dynasty. And then or later, you know, if the person's younger, you know, friends, and you come to New York and it's really hard. You can't spend your time in a coffee shop. You have to work, especially for those nice apartments that they have. So yes, I mean, misconceptions exist everywhere. People might think about the West as maybe there's loose morals, but I think the problem is not one person's stereotype or one person's perception, which may or may not be based in their own experience or the experience of their friend. The problem is generalization, right? So there's violence in the Middle East. There's violence everywhere, and there's no country that's immune from violence. So for sure they have perceptions of us that we might think of as unfair, or some people in the Arab world. But the problem is to say they all think that about us, or we all think that about them. Well, I heard that last week, was it last week or last month, you talked about, last week, critical race theory and bias. So I don't know, maybe a philosopher would weigh in. There might be, I'm out of my depth here, but I'm aware of some studies from social science or from evolutionary biology which talks about some of these biases showing up from a very young age. And some of them, you know, you can see it on the fMRI, but I don't want to really get into detail because I don't know what I'm talking about too much for that.
Just sit in this section. Three of us are going to ask the questions. So, you know, as you were talking, I just kept thinking, your students are so lucky. I mean, how fortunate to be able to have this kind of experience.
Judy's been kind to me this way for 20 years.
But one of my questions, I had several questions, but one of them is, you just mentioned kind of in passing that the First Crusade wasn't about religion. So was it about territory?
Well, I want to be clear that it was about religion. It wasn't only about religion. That's the important point. And it was about Europe being in a state of disarray. It was about military people with a lack of something to do sometimes. It was about authority, whether that authority was going to be secular or papal, and the kind of conflict between that. So there were a lot of things going on. And it was also about religion, right? There were stories that would come back of people traveling to make pilgrimage to the Holy Land, which they've been doing, and being robbed or killed or harassed by people along the way. And that kind of thing happened. Now, the idea, though, that scholars say that we need to question is whether the people doing the attacking are thinking, these Christians, you know, we need to get them because they're Christian. No, they're people coming, they've got goods, they've got money, these are crimes of opportunity, if you will. But they're sort of painted into an us versus them narrative over time. So that when we today think about the Crusades, we think of them as holy wars. It's interesting, Jonathan Lyons talks about in his book, one of the people who edited the volume of Fulcher of Chart, and going back and reading Fulcher of Chart, and this person said, gosh, there's not a lot about the holy war, the religious, and was surprised. Because the researcher came upon the study of Fulcher with this expectation of, I already know what the Crusades are about. And then when you read the Chronicles, it's like, oh, wait, well, where's this narrative that I've been taught? And so it's not that it wasn't about religion, but it wasn't only about religion. But the other thing is that it does take a few years for it to become Christianity against the Muslims. Because remember, by 1321, Dante still thinks that they're heretics. They're still Christians who went astray. So it's not quite this sense of this is a completely different religion and they're wrong for all of these reasons. So I'm going to admit to painting with some broad strokes here, you know, to give you an overview of it. which is exactly the problem that I'm saying happens, right? So I'm sort of guilty of doing that myself. But what we want to say is, can we suspend our expectations for a little bit to see what these people are actually saying during the time? Thanks. Anyone else?
Has it been forever that the concept if our religions are different, that makes you a heretic, and that means I can kill you? This has been going on for so long. You know, the Catholics and the Protestants, the Huguenots in France, the Church of England with Elizabeth and Mary, and so on. And even now, if you're different from me, where did it come from? Is it just human nature so that gives me the right to kill you and your family and everybody else?
Yeah, that's a deeply philosophical question, right? And I would go back a little bit earlier than the examples that you gave. If we look at, for example, what we might call Muslim-Christian relations in the medieval period, it's what, again, I keep going back to this guy Lyons. I really like him. But Lyons, he uses Foucault, who's a philosopher, and he says, we can talk about this as an undifferentiated experience, that when we're talking about, say, pre-11th century Christian Muslims interacting, it's an undifferentiated experience. And by that, he means that there's not a sense of a whole group of people opposed to another group of people. But what you might have is a series of threats. So if you think about the 10th century, what were they threatened by? Well, they were threatened by Vikings. They were threatened by maybe this group over here that wants what you have, but some other group by the same name doesn't necessarily threaten you. They were threatened by natural disasters. They were threatened by heretics. So, for example, the French heresies earlier than the ones that you're talking about. And so you don't necessarily think of this as Islam. It's just another threat. It's in a bag of threats that you have to worry about. But by the time we get to not the post-Crusade, but the post-First Crusade era, after the siege of Jerusalem in 1099, what you start to see solidify is an identification of these people as Muslim and a threat to us as Christian. And the Christians were well aware of the Jews and had seen them as inferior, scapegoated. I mean, if you want to just look at the Crusades as violence against Jewish people, there's studies about that. But they thought that the Jewish people had to be around as sort of testament to their crimes. And so, eventually they start to distinguish Muslims from Jewish people. And so you start to form these categories, they start to solidify. And that takes time to happen. Because if you're just, engaging with someone in the next, town over a land squabble or some, something like that, you don't necessarily think of them as extremely different. I'm kind of reminded, there's a story a friend of mine told about, he's from, I think, Minnesota, and they were driving around with his father, and somebody said something like, "Oh, there's a nice tractor in that yard." And the father said, "Yeah, they're from South Dakota." And it was like, what does that have to do with it? But it was as if, that tells you everything you need to know. And, that takes time to sort of solidify, like, what does it mean to be South Dakotan, or what does it mean to be from South? And so you have to have enough experiences that sort of build up. And one of the things that's interesting is that in places where there was more Muslim-Christian interaction, it was slower to form. And so in Spain, again, you have So David Nierenberg did a study where he was looking at sexual attitudes, and he found that prior to like the 14th century, you could convert from Muslim, for example, to Christianity, and that same day you could use the Christian brothel. Okay, so a Christian brothel, but it had been forbidden to you that morning, right? Because you were still a Muslim. Okay, but fast forward a century, and then you start to get this deeply entrenched attitude about old and new Christian, where a family could have been Christian, fast forward more than a century actually for this example, a family might have converted from Judaism or from Islam because Ferdinand and Isabella made it illegal to be a Moor, to be Muslim or Jewish in Spain when they took over. So you had to convert. And so you could convert, but 300 years later, they might still talk about your family as a new Christian. So just think about the difference between those two examples. That, Nierenberg argues that prior to that 14th century, you kind of took somebody's word, right? Oh, you converted? Great. You want to come to the brothel? Whereas, you converted when? 300 years ago. Yeah, I'm going to go over here. I'm going to talk to them, right? Because they're not new Christians. So when you think about how these attitudes form about thinking about somebody as so definable by some kind of identity that you can't even get beyond that to think about them as anything other than a threat, those take time. Or at least in these examples, we see that they take time to form. But they do form. And once they're formed, they're very hard to unentrench. You're entrenched in it.
I just want to, is it on? Yeah. I just want to put a plug in for the Kaufman Center at Grand Valley, which I don't know whether all of our members know about it, but it works. It started out in Muskegon about 25 years ago, started by Sylvia Kaufman, who started what she called Jewish-Christian dialogue. And about maybe 15 years ago, I don't remember how long, it came to Grand Valley, and now it's Jewish-Christian-Muslim dialogue. And they bring in speakers and do a lot of writing and a lot of research and talk about understanding of other religions. So they're great programs, and it's open to the public.
Yeah, and they have a website. I think you can find it through Grand Valley, right, where they have events. Mm-hmm.
It's now known as the Kaufman Interfaith Institute. Yes. I'm coming, Judy.
I have all kinds of questions. But when you talked about Said and Orientalism, and you hear sometimes that the people would call people Orientals, and now that is considered a derogatory term. Is that correct? Did that all come from Said? Did he kind of shift that perception of what it means to frame a person as, Oriental?
I don't know if Said would be solely responsible for that, but the term an Orientalist became derogatory, certainly because of his work, right? But he was looking, when we think of Oriental, I think a lot of people think about the Far East. They might think about China or Japan. But really, Said was talking, he wasn't really going that far. I mean, he was more interested, certainly Afghanistan, so further east than we would think of as the Middle East, India. He was really looking at places where Europe had colonies. And because he was himself from the Middle East, he was particularly interested in the portrayal of the Arab world. And that's where he focused his study. So his work looking at the paintings, for example, or the book, the books, the literature, the geography. But that was also, there was like a frenzy, right? So you had the colonies there, you had the Suez Canal, you had the Egyptology mania, right? So the frenzy of finding these archaeological sites. And as a person who was from the Middle East, he was particularly dismayed that the way that people talked about where he came from was so fantastical, right? I mean, he was just like talking about flying carpets and, you know, he was like, we don't have those. You do know that, right? So I think there's so much that comes out of his work that it's certainly reasonable to say that saying somebody is an Oriental becomes a derogatory phrase or label is traceable back to his work. Yeah.
Any last questions? Hearing none, please join me in giving a warm Grand Forum thank you to Dr. Fitzpatrick. Thank you.